Another example of a percentage application is something we call relative change. In fact, sometimes this is just simply referred to as percent change, but a more general title for it is relative change. We're going to look at an example involving markups at a particular office store. Let's say that office store marks up the price of both a scientific calculator and a printer by $3. So this $3 is the markup for both. So they're changing the price by increasing the calculator price by 3 and the printer cost by 3. So the price increase, what we sometimes refer to as the absolute change in both of these items, is exactly the same. It's $3. Okay, so mathematically we might call that the absolute change. It's just how the price has changed. What can be very interesting to look at, though, is the relative price increase or change. And we do that by looking at how that price has changed compared to the original prices of those items. We do that with a relative change calculation. Our relative change is going to be calculated with a division. Specifically, we're going to start with the absolute value, or actually I should say the absolute change, it doesn't have to be an absolute value, divided by the starting or original price of the object. And I've been saying price, but we can extend this out to any situation. So I'll just say original or starting amount. So notice we're doing this as a division. As we saw earlier, that's one way that we can create a percent. So the relative change is the absolute change divided by the original or starting amount. Now let's look at this for the calculator and the printer. Now a calculator is going to be cheaper than a printer, and in fact, let's say the calculator was originally listed before the markup at $15 and the printer was originally listed for $120 before they changed the price and increased it by 3. Let's look at the relative price increase for each item. So we know each item has increased as an absolute amount by $3, but let's look at the relative price increase. So remember how we're going to do this is we're going to look at the absolute change, so $3. And let's start with, we'll do the calculator on this side. So the calculator increases by $3, but the original price was $15. So when I divide 3 by 15, notice these are both dollar amounts, so the dollar amounts are going to cancel out, and we will get, doing the division, 0.2. Okay? Now remember, that's a decimal, but often what we're going to think about this relative changes is as a percent. So how we convert a decimal to a percent is we move the decimal point 2 places. So this becomes 20. We need a placeholder for the spot that we don't have anything in. So that would be a 20% increase in the price. So this 20% is telling you how the price has increased. So a 20% increase in the price of the calculator. Let's do the same thing, but for the printer. So the printer, I'll do on this side, do the same type of calculation, but the printer price, the absolute change was $3, but the original price of the printer was $120. So when we do that division, we get 0.025. Again, the decimal can be changed to a percent by moving the decimal point 2 places. So we get 2.5% increase in the price of the printer. So even though both of these items were increased by $3, when we think about that related to the original price, that is a much bigger increase in terms of price, in terms of a percent, based on the original price for the calculator compared to a relative increase for the printer of 2.5%. So the calculator has much more increased in terms of relative to its starting amount than the printer has. So this relative, as you might imagine, $3 for something that's already worth $100 isn't so big a deal, but $3 for something that only cost you $15 is going to be a big deal. So that's why we often look at relative change. Let's look at two more examples of relative change. First, the median price of a house in Portland has increased from approximately $286,000 in 2014 to approximately $523,000 in 2024. What is the relative change in home prices for this 10-year period? When we look at relative change, I think it's important as a starting point to think about what came first, what came second. So here we're talking about in 2014 a price of $286,000, and I'll put a K there after it. And then we're going out 10 years, and in 2024 the average or median home price was $523K. So what came first was that price in time of $286,000K. The reason that's important is we're going to be calculating a relative change, and remember, when you calculate relative change, you are going to be dividing by the amount you started with. And so it's important to recognize, where did we start? We started at 286,000. So I'm going to have this 286,000, and I could put the K in here, or I could write 000 to represent that that's $286,000 as my starting amount. Now, my numerator in a relative change calculation is going to be the absolute change between those two prices. So it's going to be the difference. So the absolute change would just be subtracting those, 523K minus 286K. If I do that subtraction, I get 236K. Actually, 37K, I should say. So I'm going to be, in my numerator, taking the absolute change. The change was $237,000, and I'm going to be dividing that by, again, the starting amount. So it's really important in relative change you recognize what the starting amount is. So I'm dividing these two amongst themselves. Now that K, I put in the K to represent thousands. That's just going to cancel out, and as will the dollar amount. So this is 237 divided by 286, and when I throw that into the calculator and do the division, I come up with a decimal that goes all the way across the screen, 0.82867133. So I could choose where to round that, but let's make it into a percent first. Remember, to make this into a percent, I'm going to take where the decimal is and I'm going to move it 2 places, because right now it's a decimal. So when I move it 2 places, I'm going to have 82.8, and then it depends on where I round. Okay, now let's say I want to round out to the second decimal place. So the second decimal place would be to go out to the 6. So I could write 86, but what we want to do is look at the digit that comes after the 6, and that's a 7. So we want to look 1 place beyond when we're rounding, and that 7 is more than 5. So that means the 6 is going to go up to a 7, just coincidentally. So instead of writing 82.86, I'm going to write 82.87. because it rounds up. So this, again, is my relative change. But in terms of interpreting it, we're talking about how the median prices have changed over 10 years relative to where it started. And so this, when it started, it was at 286K, and it went up in price. So when we write this out, we'd want to say 82.87% increase, because it went up in median home price. So this relative change is an increase. Now let's look at a second example, this time unemployment rates. From May 2021 to May 2022, the national unemployment rate dropped from 5.8% to 3.6%. What was the relative change of the unemployment rate over this year? So now we're just looking at how it changed over the course of a single year instead of 10 years. So we started at 5.8%. and we went down to 3.6%. So this is a relative change where the thing we're looking at is going down. So instead of saying increase here, we have a decrease as a relative change. So that's something to keep in mind, but we still calculate relative change the same way. It's going to be the absolute change in the numerator, which is basically the difference between the two percentages we had. And in the denominator, I want to remind you, we're always going to be dividing by the starting amount. So we're going to divide by 5.8%. So it's always important to remember that you're dividing by what you start with, the starting amount. Now, that numerator, I do have to do a calculation. When we look at the difference between these, we want to subtract them. And it doesn't matter which way you subtract. I usually take the bigger one minus the smaller one. This is part of why we call it the absolute change, because we're going to basically kind of ignore the sign for the time being, as long as we remember, did it increase or did it decrease for our final answer. So 5.8 minus 3.6 actually is 2.2% of a drop. So we have 2.2% as our absolute change divided by a starting amount of 5.8% for the unemployment rate. Now over here, remember up here where our thousands canceled, the same thing is going to happen with our percents. So 2.2 divided by 5.8 comes out to, with my calculator, again just do the division, 0.37931,034, etc., etc. But that is a decimal amount. To make it into a percent, which is what we want to do with relative change, we're going to move the decimal point 2 places. So this would be 37.93. I'm just going to round the same place I did up above. Now, notice this time I am going to keep the second place value the same. That 3 stays a 3 because my next digit over is a 1, and 1 is less than 5. So this does round to 37.93. The thing to remember again is that this was a decrease. So when I go to answer this out, I need to make sure that I'm thinking about writing this as a decrease in the unemployment rate. So 37.93% decrease in the unemployment rate. Relative change is pretty common, especially in news reports about how prices are changing. You'll see people quote, or you'll hear people quote relative change quite frequently. They may not say relative change, they'll probably say percent increase or percent decrease, but this is the basic process for how they're getting those numbers.